Thank you so much for accommodating us.
You're welcome.
It's great to be able to talk with you.
I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you, too, about something that I care so much about.
One of the things, like I was saying, that we really like to do is to kind of start with the history of you. How it is that you've learned your way into having the lenses you have that you sense and see the world and organize your knowledge with, your learning with. So perhaps a few minutes sketch on yourself that we feel would help us understand that.
Yeah. Well, I began teaching a good number of years ago, and I came into teaching in the regular education classroom and spent some years there and kept thinking about students that I was interacting with who weren't successful and what other route I might take that would allow me to meet their needs. And made a decision to go back to school to pursue some study in the area of learning disabilities, special education, and at the same time began to look for some other opportunity in the special education classroom, and ultimately ended up in a middle school with adolescent boys. Interestingly enough, at that particular point in time, even though I had a graduate degree in learning disabilities, I'd been certified in the state that I was then living in to not only teach, but be a diagnostician, I encountered young men, adolescents, teenagers, sometimes we call them, all right, who couldn't read, and I didn't have a clue how to teach them how to read. So I've often described that class, which was a class of, it was language arts. I've often described that class as a behavior management class. And I remember trying to get through A Tale of Two Cities with these three guys. There were three guys in the group. And I was using a text that was lower readability. And when I think about it, that was so unfair to them because I really wasn't giving them access to appropriate vocabulary and background knowledge and so on. That disappointment, because I was greatly disappointed that I wasn't able to work with them in a confident way, really made me think about where I might find some answers. To working with children who weren't learning how to read. I had in my memory some other children as well that I hadn't reached in the general education class. But I always thought that was the special educator's responsibility, and I didn't really need to worry so much about that. So I began to look at conferences and workshops that were being offered in the area, and that's how I connected with the then Orton Dyslexia Society. And I found as if I finally found a group of professionals who had a sense of how to begin to reach these children. And I became then involved in the New Jersey branch, ultimately becoming its president, ultimately pursuing study at Fairleigh Dickinson University in multisensory structured language, where I later taught and continue to teach occasionally. Continue to interact with and come to know both the researchers and the practitioners who had answers to all these questions we have about dyslexia. In the interim, as I pursued this, I began to realize I had dyslexia in my own family. And this then prompted me, I think, further in making commitments to becoming involved, even more involved with the organization. I have a brother who's dyslexic. My brother is about 5 years younger than I am. All through school, he had difficulty. I was the older sister assigned to do homework with him. That was a dismal failure. And even then, I thought I wanted to be a teacher. So it was really, that also was another disappointment in my life. We began to think of my brother as being lazy or not very capable, although he is a very capable individual. And it really wasn't until I became involved with the Orton Dyslexia Society that we realized that Christopher, in fact, is dyslexic. And we certainly have dyslexia in our family. And Christopher, one of Christopher's sons, is dyslexic as well. So it's been a very interesting journey for me. It's been a professional journey in terms of wanting to be successful. All teachers want to be successful with their students. Their competency is directly connected to their self-confidence. How they feel about themselves as educators is connected to whether or not students do well in the classroom. So it's been a professional journey for me, but it's also been a personal journey. I really feel that dyslexia is very personal. And it's not just personal on the level of the individual who has dyslexia. It's personal for the parents and the family, and it's personal for the educator. So that's how I have arrived at being the president of the International Dyslexia Association.
Great story. And I like that mix of heartful first person. It's one of the things that we look for in talking with people is this difference between learning by accumulated inference and first person, inside out, motivated learning. There's such a difference.
Well, I don't think I'm fond of when I work with teachers. I always ask them to bring the child into the room or the student into the room. I don't think we can think about the teaching learning environment without first thinking about the individual that we're working with or attempting to serve. It's really about the personal story or the individual story. That's really where the motivation needs to come from, in terms of our continuing to think through what it is we know, what else do we need to learn, and also working with the whole issue of resistance to change. We're not so able to change unless we have a reason for doing that, and I think the reason again comes back to the individual. So bring the child into the room, think through why it is that you're doing something. I also am very fond of saying to educators that I work with and train, I'm very impressed that you all want to learn. I'm very impressed that your brains are going to grow. But the reality is here that doesn't really make a great deal of difference unless that translates into student learning. It translates at the individual level.
Right. Which kind of back to where we were a moment ago. It seems that the teachers need to be equipped with this knowledge, but that's not a substitute for their own orientation, learning their way into making contact and differentiating that knowledge in relation to what the actual individual person needs.
Well, I think as we think about classrooms are very challenging for teachers, and when you spend time in school and you look at all of the demands that are put upon educators, not just in the area of special education, but also in general education today, it's understandable why they feel overwhelmed and they're sometimes resistant to changing, right? And yet, if we're able to just back up and talk about what our beliefs are about teaching and learning, I really don't know any educator who wouldn't say that they have a firm commitment to educating every child. But with that belief system or that commitment comes this willingness to be, I think, open all of the time to what are the array of solutions that are available to us. It is personal. It always has to come back to the child or the individual who has the special need or who has a learning difference, who just needs a different environment within a classroom. It's all about being prepared to meet the needs of those children that walk in the door. I think about schools and when children first come to schools. I've worked across the grade levels. And as I said earlier, I've worked in many different capacities. I've been a classroom teacher, I've been a diagnostician, and I've been an administrator. So I have that perspective. And yet what continues to ground me is I worked in a kindergarten through second grade school at one point. And I remember the first day of school vividly. I never, ever forget this. Those little bunnies, those little boys and girls getting off the bus and they're filled with joy. They're filled with enthusiasm as they walk through the doors. And the principal of that particular school was an inspiring leader. And she videoed each child as they walked through the door, and then she would show that to parents at back to school night. She knew the names of every single one of those children, and she knew the names of every single child that was in that school. There was a caring about how each of those children progressed. And that's what we really need to be about in education. We need to be about the fact that children come to school filled with joy and enthusiasm for learning. And we have to keep that fire going. I also worked in a high school setting, and that was a wonderful experience as well. And the principal in one of the schools in the district that I worked with was also an inspiring leader. There were approximately 1,000 students in that school, and he knew the name of every student in the school. So it speaks to where do you get your energy from? What drives you when you work in school? It has to be the children that are in the school and what their needs are.
Yeah, well said. And I'm sure, as you noticed in high school, that the level of enthusiasm for learning was somewhat different than it was for the little bunnies coming off in the cage, too.
Yes. Yeah. Hence the importance of intervening early on with children, particularly for those children who struggle with reading or who have dyslexia. I've certainly seen the difference. And again, I can't talk to you about this without having images of children. So what immediately comes to mind for me is this little kindergartner, Ben. All right, and Ben is probably about 25 years old now. But Ben, who came into kindergarten and was an at-risk child in terms of reading, and as he made his way through kindergarten, Ben wasn't acquiring sounds. He wasn't acquiring the names of the letters. And as he moved then into first grade, in this particular school, we were fortunate enough, even this many, 20 years ago, to have in place what would now be called a research-based reading program. And it was available in the general education classroom. And so we placed Ben in that reading program. And I remember, again, vividly sitting at the reading table about 2 or 3 months into school, and Ben working with sounds and letters, and actually with sound cards, which have letters represented on them, and the children are asked to attach sound and then to blend sound together. And as Ben finally did that, he said, "Oh, I get it. Sounds make words." Ben was on his way, all right? Ben had been reached early on. Then I remember the other child, his name being Scott. And interestingly enough, I worked in a school district kindergarten through 8th grade that then sent to a regional high school district. So I saw some of these children when they were little, and then I saw them when they were older. And Scott's reading needs had not been attended to. And now he arrives in high school, and he's still not a proficient reader. And yet he's a very capable young man. He's very talented, very athletic, bright, inquisitive, could capture thoughts auditorily through oral conversation in class, was in academic classes, and yet still not reading. And while Scott may have appeared to many to be well-adjusted, if you really knew Scott, right, you knew the pain that Scott was still feeling because he had not yet learned how to read. I don't know any dyslexics, and I know quite a few of them, successful and not successful. But regardless of where they are in life, when they speak to you about school, and they speak to you about what it's like to be dyslexic, you hear the pain in their voice. And so the difference between intervening early on with youngsters or waiting until, and yet at the same time, I would not want anyone to feel that we can't intervene later on. We can. And in this particular high school setting where I worked, we did put in place a program for young men and women who had not learned how to read. We put in place a multisensory structured language program. We had options. So while those students participated in academically challenging classes, and many of them went on to a post-secondary setting, we still were attending to teaching them how to read. That certainly takes longer. There's certainly more barriers. They don't have the same belief in themselves in terms of their capability that they had earlier on. They've begun to doubt their capabilities, and yet, as you work with them in an appropriate program, as you allocate resources, and administratively I did that. As you allocate resources, you see a new person emerge. And yet they still do carry with them, I can't get away from this. They carry with them some of this pain because they weren't like all those other little boys and girls who came to school and experienced the magic of reading, which they should experience by the end of first grade. My sister, who teaches first and second grade, she loops with her children, loves the spring of the year because she said magic happens in the spring of the year. These little ones go home not knowing how to read, still barking at the print, as Jean Shaw would say. And they come back the next day and all of a sudden they're reading. So magic happens. We need to make magic happen much earlier for these children. We can't forget the adolescents. We need to continue to address, and the adults, but we need to make it happen much earlier for them.
This dovetails really nicely with the work of neuroscientists and other researchers like Sean Koff, studying early childhood development, about the difference between critical development and sensitive development, and that there's no question that neuroplasticity studies show us that we can remediate just about anything.
Right.
But the neurological and pedagogical efficiency and the systemic ability to do it, and working against the in our language, shame aversion that's developed, all are working against the further we go. So nobody's a lost cause. We never want to paint that picture on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's really vital that we get early into this, that we meet children earlier in the developmental sequence.
Well, it's so vital from a number of points of view. Certainly from the point of view of how children feel about themselves. Erik Erikson, I think, said, "I am what I can make work," and by age 4 or 5, kids have a good sense of what they can make work. So it's vital from that point of view. It's also critical from the point of view of children having access then to curriculum that they're cognitively capable of. I think that any of us who have worked with adolescents have seen over and over again the effects of not having access to print. So that these young men and women, again, adolescents, come to the middle school or the high school setting, and they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the background knowledge, they haven't built the schema that really allows them to interact in an appropriate way with the content areas. If, in fact, they had that access to print, this would have been facilitated for them. This is not about their cognitive competence. It's about the fact that they have a weakness, and that weakness hasn't been addressed or remediated early on. And I would totally agree with you that all that we've learned from neuroscience is incredibly helpful for us as educators, because it allows for us to determine where we need to put our resources, where we need to focus our energy, what our curriculum needs to look like at an early age. The other thing that happens as children get older is, particularly when they enter high school, is where do you find the time in an academic high school, for instance, to address the remediation of reading difficulty? I mean, we have to do it, but where do you find the time?
Yeah, one of my favorite conversations was with the guy who's the president of the Oregon School Psychological Association. And, his point was, why don't we just full stop? I mean, it's clear that, the children need their science and they need their social studies and they need all these other dimensions, but not having those isn't anywhere near as important as being off the track on reading and how it connects to everything else. So the idea that we can kind of think of reading remediation as a parallel rather than as central until it's working,
Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If we actually ask our teachers and our administrators and our specialists to step back and look at what are the prerequisite skills that students need in order to participate in a content area. I mean, reading is the very first skill, and then certainly the ability to express oneself in writing. And for the struggling reader, both of those areas, both the reading piece and the written expression, are very often affected. So how do we interact in an academic environment if we don't have those skills? And yet I understand from having worked in schools what the pressures and the demands are. I mean, we have high stakes testing. We have parents that want students to be in regular education or general education classes. We have administrators who are very focused on what's the latest thing that they have to attend to in terms of policy. So there's competing demands, and sometimes we just lose sight of what's really essential.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's an enormous institutional inertia working against the healthy development of the children in need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is. I mean, if you visit schools and if you sit around the table at an administrative meeting, it becomes very apparent that the conversation is not about necessarily about the individual needs of students, but it's more about the policies and the political demand and the demand from community than it is about let's take a look at and let's refocus on what it is that we want every child to leave the school knowing and being able to do. And schools very often will attend to that as they engage in strategic planning, and there'll be a renewed interest and focus on these topics, but they soon get lost in this bureaucratic, and it is an institutional inertia. And yet, I have to say that being an administrator is a difficult task. They face many challenges, and there are many good administrators. The difference in schools, I think, that thrive are administrators that are leaders versus administrators that are managers. And they don't forget about the leadership piece. The management is critical for the school to open every day and the buses to take the children to the right places and budgets to be balanced and so on. But it's this educational leadership piece that's so critical. You know, as we think about the preparation of educators, we talk a great deal about teachers and highly qualified teachers, and there's no doubt that's important. I don't think we talk enough about the preparation of administrators, both general education and special education administrators. I think that gets lost sometimes with a focus on the management domain.
Let's. What I'd like to do now is to kind of step back for a moment and ask for an oversight of the International Dyslexia Association, the organization, how many people you're serving, how many people are involved. And then after that, I want to come back down deep into reading and dyslexia and defining some terms, and then we'll hook back around into what are we doing about it in school and otherwhere. Is that okay?
That would be fine. Okay. Well, the International Dyslexia Association has a very proud history. The organization itself is over 50 years old. Was originally the Orton Dyslexia Society, and a few years ago became the International Dyslexia Association. We currently have over 40 branches. They're across the United States. Some branches have more, some states have more than one branch. There are a few states where we don't have branches, unfortunately, and we're always trying to cultivate the beginning of a new branch so that we can serve constituencies across the country. We also have 4 international affiliates that we continue to work with actively, and one of our committees, in fact, is the Global Partners Committee, and we're working actively to bring other national affiliates into our group. And we certainly cultivate relationships with other dyslexia associations, such as the British Dyslexia Association, European Dyslexia Association, and so on. The branches, of course, work at the local level. And so at the local level, the branches are interacting with members through conferences, through workshops, parent meetings, sending newsletters, having referral lines where parents can call or educators can call for information about dyslexia. They're all volunteers. They work very hard. Many of them are educators. Many of them are parents. Many individuals on our boards at the local level are dyslexics. And then, of course, we have a national board, and we have a headquarters in Baltimore, and a small staff that supports our national board. And our national board, much like our local branches, they're all volunteers, including myself. So, and we have varied representation on that board. We have researchers, we have practitioners, we have individuals who are dyslexic, we have attorneys, we have individuals who are involved in business and politics, and so on. Our focus, we have over 13,000 members. Our focus is to support research, to disseminate information, to promote effective practice. We've been known for years as the advocates or the supporters of multisensory structured language, which evolved out of the Orton-Gillingham approach. Dr. Samuel Orton, for all of us, is the individual who we look up to and continue to reflect on how some of us are fond of saying Dr. Orton was right. He was right in many respects, dyslexia being more widespread than originally thought, having a neurological base, explicit systematic instruction being appropriate, and so on. At the national, international level, we have conferences. We have an annual conference. We have a specialized conference. We have one coming up this summer in Washington, which is focused on research to practice, advances in literacy. We also have publications, a scholarly journal, the Annals of Dyslexia, Mid-Range Journal. We continue to publish and to develop materials that disseminate information, basic fact sheets. We recently developed an educational outreach kit, which can be used in schools and with parents to educate them about dyslexia. We support research proposal. We have special projects in place. We're developing a matrix, for instance, that will give the public more information about what are the multisensory structured language programs, how can they be used, are they most effective for prevention, intervention, or intensive remediation. I've probably forgotten many, many things. The organization works very hard. It works very hard. Certainly, we all learn a great deal as we work together, but we're working very, very hard so that individuals with dyslexia, that resource that they have, and this is part of our purpose statement, that resource that they possess can be liberated to benefit society. That's who our ultimate client is. Our ultimate client is the dyslexic and their family. Certainly, many of our members are professional, but this is really about how do we ultimately benefit the dyslexic and their family.
That's great. Thank you. You used the term international.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the distribution or the percentage of the population that has dyslexia in different countries or languages.
Yeah. Well, the prevalence. Now you've asked me a question that's number wise, and I have to stop you for a minute because I'm not going to be able to give you the numbers. David, I'll be honest, I don't remember numbers. This is like one of my weaknesses. So I certainly can respond that, dyslexia is prevalent across language because it is a language-based disability, and it really doesn't matter whether or not it's Portuguese or Italian or Chinese. Certain languages are more transparent than others. There's more of a one-to-one correspondence between sound and symbol. But regardless of the language, because this is a neurological difficulty, the brains are wired differently. The problem does persist across languages. Yeah. can give you a number in terms of English, but yeah. Yeah. Oh. Oh. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't give you the numbers for all the different languages, but that's not.
We've read studies that show
Yeah.
that it's highest in the English language.
Well, I think that's probably true. All right.
And you can speak to that. That's great. And if you don't
Yeah.
feel comfortable with it, that's great.
Yeah.
I don't ever
Yeah.
want to be pushing.
I'd like to be. For me to say it, I'd have to be very familiar with the studies, and I can say something about geography in English, though, which makes it more difficult. Yeah, yeah. Well, when one begins to think about English, our language, while we can explain how our language developed, and we certainly can explain the consistencies and inconsistencies of our language. And in fact, when we teach a multisensory structured language program, what we try to do is talk to our students about what is regular in the language and what is explainable. At the same time, we do have a very difficult orthography. We have 44 or so speech sounds, depending upon which linguist you're reading, and we have 26 letters. And we have to use those letters in many different combinations to represent, or we do use those letters in many different combinations to represent the sounds. And so as you begin to take a look at our language, originating from Anglo-Saxon, and then looking at the influence of the Romance language, and then the influence of Greek, and then ultimately the influence of some other languages, one begins to realize the complexity of being able to decode words and then to be able to encode words, spell words. But that's really what multisensory structured language programs are about. They're really about looking at how does the language move from being regular to irregular? What are the patterns that we can explain to our students? Not so that they memorize those patterns, but so that they internalize and become familiar with the different configurations that will represent the sounds in our language.
Good. What is dyslexia?
Well, dyslexia can be described in a number of different ways. Some of us are very fond of how Sally Shaywitz describes it. She talks about it as being a weakness in a sea of strengths, a weakness specifically in language, in the phonological component of language. Others talk about it being an unexpected underachievement in a particular area. And then others in a more formal way, and the International Dyslexia Association does have a formal definition for dyslexia. It was co-developed with the National Institute of Health, and it is the definition that they currently use for dyslexia. That definition talks about the fact that it is a type of learning disability, so it's a specific learning disability, not the only type of learning disability there is, but a specific one. That it's language-based, and in fact, when we look at individuals who have language-based learning disabilities, about 80% of them have difficulty learning how to read. This is what happens with dyslexics, right? That the difficulty really is the result of difficulties in phonological processing, this ability to take in, manipulate, work with, and then express language. Specifically, this ability, when I described Ben earlier, I was talking about how Ben all of a sudden made this discovery that sounds make words. He was really lacking in phonological awareness. This difficulty to work with, manipulate, sound, so that we can put sounds together to not only read words, but spell words. All right. When we work with dyslexics and when we think about how we define dyslexics, we talk about this inability to decode accurately, an inability to read words not only correctly, but also in a fluent or automatic way. And we also know that for the dyslexic, that there's often unintended consequences because of this lack of access to print, the unintended consequences being diminished vocabulary and diminished background knowledge, which certainly then affects comprehension. When I work with teachers, I always say to them, think about the child who can't get through words. They can't crack the code, the alphabetic phonetic code that our language is made up of. This is not about the child who reads things backwards or reverses letters. This is about the child who literally, can't get through the words. All of their attention is focused on reading the word, and they don't appear to have any system for reading words, so they read them differently each time they see them, and they spell them differently each time they see them. So children who can't crack the code.
I'm going to adjust the mic one more time. You're hearing that?
That's okay. Sorry. It may not be my technology. I've had several things go wrong with me over the last week in terms of technology. I always say I'm afraid to touch any of it. Something goes bluey.
Yeah, it's amazing when you have to think about what is technology.
Yeah. Good.
So what is reading?
Wow, what is reading? Well, reading is an exceptionally complex act. If we begin to think, there's different models and different theories out there that tell us what reading is. Ultimately, reading is the ability to make meaning out of what it is that we read. All right, that's the end goal. But what goes into that is very complex. When we come to print on a page, we have to bring with us some capabilities in the phonological area. We have to be able to work with sounds. We have to have a sense of whether or not speech sounds correspond to the sounds that, what it is that we're saying corresponds to what it is that we're hearing. We have to have this capability to isolate sound, to identify sound, to put sound together in order to read words. We also have to bring with us this connection to orthography, to the visual patterns. So this is another component of reading that influences whether or not a child is proficient. So we have to be able to recognize the visual patterns, the letters that represent the sound. We have to be able to recognize chunks within words, prefixes, suffixes, morphemes, our roots, all of those being morphemes. Recognize syllable pattern. That connection, that's the phonology and the orthography connection, really needs to be very tight so that what we're able to do then is read words in a very automatic way. Then we also need to bring with us our meaning processor. I'm thinking, as I'm speaking to you, I'm thinking about McClellan and Seidenberg's model, in which we have a phonological processor. We're taking in the sounds of our language and we're working with that. And then we have an orthographic processor and we're taking in the visual representations and then we're making this tight connection. But at the same time, we need to be bringing our understanding of meaning, our mental lexicon, our vocabulary to bear on what it is that we're reading. So that also facilitates our ability to read the word. And then we have to bring with us our background knowledge, our schema, the context in which we see the words so that we can make sense of the passage or the text that we're being asked to read. It's incredibly complex, and it's fascinating as an educator to think about the fact that underlying this, are all these different neural mechanisms that really have to be working somewhat simultaneously and together in order for us to read words.
Just to give us a place to play with, relative to this, we've begun thinking of reading as distinct from other language processes, as a code instructed and code informed virtual reality experience. It's an artificial language, like the way a scroll piano plays music from the scroll, right? With the PA being the keys and the roll causing the keys to play, and in order that creates comprehensible music. That it's that it overlays, but is distinctly different than our language processes, in that it's an interface to a technology. How does that fit for you when I just describe relative to your description? What I heard you saying was different aspects of describing its complexity, but as a phenomena, it seems it's an artificial reality experience that's informed and instructed by a technology.
You're talking about the code itself. Yeah, the code itself. Well, I think a few things come to mind as you say that. I begin to think about the fact that for so many years, language existed without the alphabetic phonetic code, spoken language, individuals who lived on the earth long ago had an oral tradition and were able to process language quite nicely and communicate with one another quite nicely without having that alphabetic phonetic code. It really brings to mind for me, I have a colleague who, in fact, is going to be the next president of IDA, who talks about dyslexia as being related to social consequence. If we didn't have to read, dyslexics would function quite nicely without this alphabetic phonetic code getting in the way. So I think in response to what you just said, yeah, it does seem somewhat artificial. It seems as if it's been layered on and created. Certainly our language is natural. We come into the world being able to speak and communicate with one another, and you know that in listening to little babies make all of the different sounds. As Patricia Kuhl says, universal citizens, they make all of the sounds, and then they begin to cull out these sounds for the sounds of their language. So I think I can resonate with what it is that you've said. It is somewhat artificial. It is a technology, and it's been layered on to give us yet another way of communicating.
Yeah. There's depending on which anthropological linguist you talk to. I mean, we've been, or you go the genetic route, or you look at the anthropological evidence for the jaw and the teeth and the throat and all that stuff. We've been talking for between 60,000 and 1 million years, and there's a lot of fuzz about that, but a long time. The alphabet is 3,500 years old or so. But the particular kinds of confusions that are unique to the challenges of today are only a few hundred years old. So there's a unprecedented processing challenge that learning to read involves, that is unlike any processing challenge that this organism ever experienced before.
Or was designed perhaps for. Yeah, or was designed for. It is fascinating to think about that, and it's fascinating to think about the fact that if in fact we used a different method of communication. I always think about Norm Geschwin, and Norm Geschwin talked about the fact that if everyone came to school and had to learn music as the way in which we communicated, we would have some individuals who had dysmusica. And so I think it's analogous to that. It's something that we've created in order to communicate in a written way, and we weren't designed to be able to do that. That's that's a very interesting thing for an educator to think about, because that's not the way an educator thinks.
That's part of the mission of what we're doing.
Yeah.
Is to help reframe how we think about
this.
Yes,
and I think that's absolutely critical, because and again, it brings me back to how we make good decisions about reading instruction or any instruction in school. What is that based upon? is it based upon, and Sharon Vaughn really speaks to this quite nicely, is it based upon craft? It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and we put it together, and that's our craft. And maybe that's not so bad, all right? Or is it based on superstition and myth? We think that works, and we've always done it this way, and that's the way we're always going to do it. Or is it informed by science? Can science tell us something that we haven't been listening to previously that can allow us to deliver instruction in a way that's more suitable to the organism that we in fact are? And I'm also very interested in, because I have a general education background as well as a special education background. I said to you I began in general education. My last position in public schools, I was in public schools over 30 years. My last position was back in general education as a director of professional development. So I'm very, very interested in how we work with teachers to keep moving them along a continuum of expertise. All right, how do we move them from being a novice teacher, to an expert teacher? And as a result, I have a knowledge of other approaches to instruction that go beyond reading, like brain-based learning. Now, some of that really is still superstition and myth, but there's some bases. There are some things that are beginning to emerge even from that particular way of thinking that we need to be attending to more in classrooms. So I think you raise a very interesting point. We talk about informed instruction. Well, what's that really connected to? Informed by what? And certainly it's important that we use our clinical experience to inform our instruction, but we also need to look at the evidence, and we need to look at the evidence from the point of view of what science is telling us, and also what does the data tell us about students in terms of how well they're performing.
Right, and how does all of that science itself represent a particular set of lenses?
Yeah.
So how do we have science continuing to improve what we can see, how we can measure, how we can translate it to practice, and how do we be outside of that box, looking beyond the current framework that science is investigating through? I mean,
Well, I think also, how do we create the bridge? And this is the challenge. How do you create the bridge? Because the educators are going to go to school every day, and they're going to stand up and deliver. Although we hope they do that in varied ways, all right, besides stand up and deliver. But they're going to go to school every day and do their job, and science is going to go to the labs or wherever and do their job every day. How do we create the bridge between the two?
Yeah, that's the distributed dialogue that has to happen.
Yeah, and
so that these things aren't so distinct.
That's
and
right.
That the teaching is the learning edge of science.
That's
science is the background informing field that's unfolding through teaching. In a non-mechanical, robotic way. Right.
So if we step back and think about that, we really need to totally change, all right, teacher preparation. And we need to change professional development.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And then that brings back the question where we were earlier, which is this difference between being a robotic extension that is using a script to relate to a child, or to their children, following a script that they don't have a deep first-person ground in understanding, then what are we modeling for the kids?
Right. How are we prompting them to go beyond the concrete, in essence? How are we prompting them to think about their world and themselves as an individual? And how are we modeling for them an interaction that has to happen in terms of decision making and problem solving and all of these things that allow for us to participate in a society?
Precisely. And that's what we mean by first-person learning. How does the teacher become an exhibitory first-person learning in how she's conducting or he's conducting the class, and in how they're tuning in to be maximally relevant and helpful for each child. Right.
And so also, as you're talking about this, David, what I'm coming back and thinking about is the issue of educators being reflective about their practice. And so you made me think about that when you said script. All right. And certainly, I do think in reading we need to directly and explicitly teach children, but we also have to be reflective about whether or not what we're doing is having the desired effect with the child. And any educator who's metacognitive in nature will always be stepping back and kind of having this internal dialogue with themselves that in fact would be so beneficial if they would think about modeling that dialogue for the children that are in their classroom.
Exactly what we're learning makes the big difference in language engagement affect it before 4 that sets all this in motion.
Right.
It's the same phenomenon.
Right. So beginning to prompt educators, all right, to not work, and here's the other thing that just came to mind, and it's because of a conversation I overheard yesterday about basals, all right? Not thinking that basals are the be-all and the end-all. They're important, they're tools, all right? But they cannot alone guide the teaching that goes on in classrooms, all right? Exactly. All right, being able to step back, look at how your instruction is delivered, and how you continue to scaffold for children. This movement from we could think about a readiness stage all the way to a proficiency stage. How do we move children through those stages, and what do the strategies and activities look like that allow us to do this? Now you're really talking about ratcheting up the preparation and the professional development of educators, because quite frankly, whether we're talking about the individual who serves the child with dyslexia and remediates the child, or the specialist in clinic setting, or we're talking about the general education teacher, they have not been prepared to deliver instruction in the way that we're talking. All right, they've been prepared to deliver instruction based on formula. All right, and formula is fine. I'm not denying that, but at the same time, they've not been taught to reach deeply into this kind of repertoire that they should have and probably don't, in order to keep thinking about how they're meeting the needs of these different kids. It is such. I mean, teaching and learning is an incredibly complex act. It's an incredibly complex act. And if we look at the way that schools are structured right now, we're not supporting the learning of our teachers, all right, in order for them to do what we're talking about. Right? If you just reflect quickly on what professional development looks like in schools today.
For the most part, it's training teachers not to be first-person learners.
That's right. It's drive-by staff development. It's the one-shot deals. There's no time for processing. There's no time for thinking. There's no time for application.
And yet, orientation's everything. How they're oriented to what they're doing is
right.
Guiding everything.
Right. So to change this is an enormous task. But I'm an idealist. So I do believe. All right. What else are we going to do? That's exactly right. What else are we going to do? And what are we all about in schools if it isn't to keep thinking about and searching for the solutions for these different kids? But always that kid is at the center. That's why I started by saying this is personal. This is not, it doesn't matter to me whether or not you're in the gen ed class, or in the special ed class. It's personal. It's about the kids who walk through the door. Yeah.
And inside of that, I'm really enjoying our tracking together here. When we talk with educators, we just did a New York Association of Special Educator Administrators. Mm-hmm. So it kind of lines up with some of what we were talking about. So a room full of talking to them. And the first question we asked is, what is it about a child's development that's not fundamentally affected by how well they're learning? Mm-hmm. What aspect?
Mm-hmm. There is no aspect.
There is no aspect.
There is no aspect.
Okay.
All right.
Exactly. So what's a higher objective goal than stewarding the health of their learning in general as our organizing, orienting reference for whatever it is in particular we're teaching?
Yeah. One of the things that gets forgotten in schools connects directly to what you just said. It has to do with the emotional aspect of learning, all right, and how children feel when they even walk into a classroom, all right, and what does it mean What does it mean to create classrooms that are safe environments for children in which to experience learning and in which to explore learning? So we have a responsibility academically, but we have a much larger responsibility than that when it comes to serving the kids in schools.
One of the most important dimensions in all of this that we're really pushing, I've had conversations with probably a dozen neuroscientists so far, and keep moving through the field of different neuroscientists to kind of build a little community, is to create a more solid case for understanding the effect of affect on cognition.
Right.
Because that's missing, and yet that is. I mean, like we're talking about coming all the way back to reading and the reading conversation. I want to get at the definition of dyslexia and the dimensions of that. But clearly we understand together that the amount of children that are affected by reading improficiency, it's a huge spectrum, with dyslexia on one end of it and reading improficiency doing this big thing.
That's right.
And that reading improficiency has it's connected to children coming into this artificially confusing challenge. And the context of this challenge precipitating in them, causing them to feel as if they're at fault for this confusion. Right. Developing, just as reading itself requires faster than conscious reflexes to do the virtual reality processing, when children become pre-consciously shame averse to the feeling of confusion, because the confusion brings shame, then they start to avoid it autonomically. What happens to children that start to autonomically avoid the confusion they experience? It decapitates their learning. Right? And so we've got this happening en masse. And it's because we don't understand that the relationship between cognitive entrainment, cognitive task, and affect, both in terms of when as soon as this affect triggers, it disrupts and disentrains whatever cognition's doing in the microtime movements of processing, let alone the collateral.
Well, at various times I've talked with educators, particularly those that I was responsible for in the last position I had in public school. It was I was the director of professional development, but the reality is I didn't do stand up and deliver. I did a great deal of facilitation, and I worked with mentors and new teachers, all the new teachers in the district. And I said to them up front, sometimes your administrator has kind of it's like having the hidden curriculum in the classroom that you don't tell kids about, or a hidden agenda. I said to them, I'm going to tell you up front that this no hidden agendas here. I'm going to look for, when I come to your classroom, what that classroom feels like, what the environment is like, whether or not you've created an environment in which those students feel welcomed, particularly adolescents, right? And in which they feel that they can take a risk, right, in terms of their own learning. Also, when I've worked with teachers in general, I've talked to them about stepping back and thinking about what must it be like to come to school every day, right? And school is going to be all about the thing that you don't do well, that you have found difficult. All right, if I said to you, come to school or come to work 180 days a year, and 80% of the time that you're, at work or at school, wherever you happen to be, I'm going to ask you to do the thing you don't do well, what would you do? What would you do? So, this is, for me, it's about the kids that misbehave. It's about the kids who go to the school nurse. It's about the kids who, call home lots of times. It's about the kids who don't show up to school. It's all about those kids, in working with, and certainly little kids realize this early on, but it isn't always manifested as, it's not always as visible. Their feelings are not always as visible as they become when they're in middle and high school. And it's really those kids that I was always most attracted to, the kids who were really challenging, because I think you'd have to peel away these layers. They're not coming to school because they don't want to learn. I mean, that's not what this is all about. It's because what it's all about is that school right now, all right, is not providing them with the supports, the scaffolding that they need in order to learn and feel competent about themselves. That affect piece,
to deal with the pain and shame that
there is none. I'll tell you a very this is an interesting story about, I have a keynote speech that I do, and it's called The Courage to Teach, Learn, and Parent. And I look at the emotional experience from each one of those individuals' perspectives, because we connect around emotion. This is a way to change behavior. When we begin to hear one another's stories and understand one another's perspective. And I delivered this speech last year in the Southwest, and I received a letter about 2 or 3 weeks after I delivered the speech, and it was from a gentleman who is dyslexic and had just decided to come to the conference, and told me in the letter that he realized about 10 years ago that he was dyslexic, and thought he had in fact dealt with his feelings about it. And he had a successful life. He was an architect. Go figure. Not so surprising, okay? And had a lovely family, and yet he cried through the entire speech and all the way home. And the reason that he did that is because I raised those emotions that he had submerged. So individuals, whether they're at one end of the spectrum or not, and I would agree with you, there are certainly individuals who experience reading difficulty in school who are not dyslexic, all right? And they're experiencing those difficulties for a number of reasons, including the curriculum being inappropriate, all right, and the teaching, not matching what their needs are. But there are a number of individuals that are walking around with these feelings of inadequacy, and then you begin to think about, all right, this individual who wrote to me certainly has contributed to society. But what's been lost in his life, and what about the individuals who haven't been successful? What's that potential that we've lost because of these feelings of incompetence, inadequacy, and so on? Despite the fact that every individual has an area in which they can succeed,
Like Rick Lavoie's story, a couple
Yes.
of Rick Lavoie stories, right?
Yes.
About the boy with the ear and
Yes.
and that.
Yeah.
And then One
Yeah.
Dwarf and others. Did you get a sense of just how powerful this is?
Yeah.
And translate that later to shame avoidance, right? What's going on at the avoidance level. And then go into the neurocognitive and show the effect of the shame on cognitive processes. So that all three of these things link together.
That's so important. That is so important. And you see, that's a forgotten factor here. I mean, those of us who work in this field, and those of us who know dyslexics, understand that, all right? But there's not been nearly enough attention given to that. When we do
our seminars, the teachers are particularly, the history hits them, the dimensions hit them, but the shame piece really hits them.
Yeah.
And we just did the research. We closed the International Linda Mood Bell conference in D.C. And a gentleman there who was the husband of Linda Mood Bell's New York head came up just completely crying.
Oh yeah. I got this letter. I got this letter, and I was like, I cried quite a bit when I read the letter. But it was such a powerful reminder for me. I mean, and the reason I do the courage speech is I talk about knowledge at the end. I talk about knowledge connecting us, and we have to listen to experience and so on. But I do it for just that reason, because I want teachers to understand, all right? And I want parents and dyslexics to understand one another's perspectives. The perspective of the individual with dyslexia, no matter how successful, and I tell the story of my brother. I mean, my brother owns his own company. He's the only one of us who didn't go to college. Up until 5 years ago, my mother was still saying she'd pay for his courses if he wanted to go to college. To tell you where my mother's head was, okay? She was also denying he was dyslexic, okay? But, I talk about the fact that, and I've written an article about him, what it was like for him going through school. He has a beautiful boat in Boston Harbor. You know the name of the boat? Perseverance. Every boat that he's owned, that has been the name of the boat, So, there's an individual who sits, I'm on the National Advisory Council for Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic. There's an individual who sits on that council with me he's literally a rocket scientist. Right? The last meeting that I went to, with them, I did our education outreach presentation for them. Because despite the fact they're recording for the blind and dyslexic, some of them, they understand the blind population extremely well. They have representatives of the dyslexic population on their boards and councils and so on. But, in terms of really understanding dyslexia, well, he cried through the whole presentation. I mean, so it's like, and that unwillingness, that reluctance to talk that you're talking about, that Jim Wendorf is noting, that's the same kind of thing. I mean, it's very difficult to have a deep conversation with individuals with dyslexia, adult dyslexics, even adolescents, because this is so painful for them. At the same time, I think it's really important for us to remember that, and this is that it's painful for the parents. So that parent perspective is very, very important, I think. And for many teachers, it's painful. I talk about myself as I was dysteachic. If it weren't for the International Dyslexia Association, I would have never, ever found the solutions for working with kids, right? And I still regret to this day, I can picture those 3 boys that I sat with in that 7th grade class. I mean, I know they're not proficient readers because I know nothing happened for them when they moved on to high school. We hadn't put the program, I wasn't there, and other teachers there hadn't put a program in place yet. I hope they ended up on a good path. I don't know. But I feel guilty about those kids. So this whole emotional piece and the shame piece it's just critically important to talk about.
Yeah. Thank you. We agree. And the thing is that the tendency is to talk about this as a consequential emotional development. But there's a continuum here in which this is a participant in the cause of what's stuttering the processing as this dropping in and out of self-transparency with this shame awareness and this threshold of shame that's changing the more and more difficulty somebody has.
Yeah, well, how available do you make yourself for learning?
Yeah.
I mean, how available can you be?
How available is learning? It's not even going through you. It's deeper than you.
Right. And what are your belief systems about whether or not you can even begin to engage in the task, or what level of participation, if in fact you do engage in the task, because of this fear of failure, at what level do you engage? Certainly not at the more abstract levels.
That's what I mean by shame avoidance, the degree to which people we interviewed people that, all of the incredible strategies they developed to avoid this, or like Wedgeworth at pro-literacy. Again, they're not talking dyslexia; we're just talking about reading difficulties or illiteracy.
Right.
And I want to come back before we close here and make sure we connect that spectrum better.
Yeah.
But consumer behavior of low literates, right? They're going to a store, and what's primary in their consciousness is getting out of there without getting embarrassed. Right.
Well, you have conversation with individuals who don't read very well. I mean, they describe all sorts of avoidance behaviors, or they describe compensatory behaviors in which someone else is doing it for them. Marrying someone who's a good speller, having your wife make all of the lists, taking on positions in life that don't require reading. Or seeking out for the adult who has literacy difficulties, seeking out assistance when the reading is required for them to move to the next level, or in many instances totally avoiding it and not moving to the next level. So the consequences are unbelievable in terms of this inability to interact with print and to read. Yeah.
Excellent. That's great, Jewel. We've talked about it a couple of times. Let's go to this. Let's talk about this continuum. I mean, it seems to us, if you look at the number of children that are below proficient, according to NAEP, even if you discount it pretty radically, and you look at the low literates as determined by NIFL and a convergence of information coming in from justice, coming in from medical, we're talking about close to 100 million people in the United States whose lives have been diminished to various degrees, but still significantly, because they didn't get to a point where this reading thing popped through and it became transparent. For them.
Yeah. Well, I think it relates to what we're being told at this particular point, that we probably have about 30 to 40% of our kids, dependent upon who you're reading, that are these at-risk readers. And out of that percentage, we have a smaller percentage that are what we would term as dyslexics. Now, again, dependent upon who you're reading, the number of dyslexics in the population, we see anything from 5 to 20%. It's probably, I think NICHD talks about 5 to 10%. IDA's literature talks about 15 to 20%. Regardless, even if we just kind of settle on a middle number, let's say 10 in every 100, all right? That still leaves a huge number of individuals who are not dyslexic, whose brains aren't wired in a different way, who have reading difficulty, all right? Now, what's the answer to that? Well, the answer to that is we need to change the way we address reading instruction in schools. I mean, we have to be looking at how we screen out and identify those little kids early on. And I think we're on the right track. We have some tools, we have some measures that we can now use. The problem is they're not being used consistently enough across this country. I mean, despite the policies, No Child Left Behind, put reading first, even the reauthorization of IDEIA, with reference to response to intervention, we still don't have the capacity or the will to change what it is that we're doing with reading early on. And so consequently, unless we make those significant changes, we're not only going to lose the dyslexic, and certainly that's my primary concern, but I'm also concerned about these other children, these other struggling readers.
NAEP says 84% of
Huge,
African American
huge,
12th graders, 88%
right,
fourth graders.
Huge numbers. And I'll tell you, as a result, really, the International Dyslexia Association, we're very committed to dyslexics, but we're not just committed to individuals with dyslexia. We're committed to all individuals who have difficulty learning how to read. We've become, I think it's notable that, in fact, we're no longer the Orton Dyslexia Society. We're the International Dyslexia Association because we want to be more broad-based. We want to stay true to what our original mission was. Right? But we think we have something to say about reading instruction in general, looking at direct, explicit, systematic instruction. This is what we've been talking about for 50 years. We're very grateful to the researchers. We're very grateful to Congress because it's providing more of an impetus to address the needs of dyslexics, but we don't want to forget about those other kids.
Is there anything that we've touched on that you think, I mean, we've gone back to early childhood, we've gone to the dimensions that I've been most interested. I mean, we could drill into things a little bit more deeply, but I appreciate your desire to stay away from numbers and what have you. So I kind of skirted those.
I'm so concerned when you use numbers because, even as I look at the literature for our organization, which I think we'll be rewriting again soon, we have Louisa Motes on our board again. So she'll probably be helping us with that. But the numbers fluctuate dependent upon who you're reading. And I think when we think about dyslexia and learning disabilities, and I love that term, reading in proficiency, we're learning every day. Learning disabilities is a new field. So is dyslexia. And so I think as the science informs our practice, we'll have a better sense of what those numbers really are. I don't want to underestimate the numbers because then people will begin to say, in general, society says, well, that's just not much of a problem at all. It's more of a problem than one perceives at this particular point, I think. And yet at the same time, I don't want to nail it. I don't want to nail it.
But I want to suggest this. I mean, if you look at all the things that a kid born today is at risk for.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The possibility of a physical developmental issue or a cognitive, neurological, physiological developmental issue, or even abuse, all the things we put stats on, if you add them together.
Yeah.
And then you look at the number of children that don't make it to reading proficiency.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The risk of having their lives harmed because they didn't make it to reading proficiency overwhelms in size
it's huge.
all the other things combined.
It's huge. That's a really interesting perspective. It's not something that, because I tend to think very much in terms of dyslexia or let's say the 30% of kids, but when you begin to talk about all these different factors that play in, it's a startling way, I think, or it's a very different way of looking at this and realizing how much more significant
That's what I think we need to do. And it's
Yeah.
not so much that I'm trying to get some exact number,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
want to create a magnitude of order
Yeah.
juxtaposition
Yeah.
that says, look, we're spending all this energy and all this attention
Yeah.
over here, rightfully
Yeah.
so.
Well,
but we're missing.
Well, yeah. I mean, even when you begin to think about, you mentioned something about juvenile justice, I think, earlier, and you begin to look at the incarcerated youth, and you look at the percentage of incarcerated youth that are reading below fourth grade level. Many of them probably not reading at all. You look at what's their life opportunity going to be, and what has it been to this point, and what will it be, based on not only the fact that now that they've been convicted of whatever crime they've committed, but that they're still going back into society without the skills to participate in society. Or you look at the number of individuals with drug and substance abuse. I mean, how many of them are killing off the pain with drugs?
All these things are expressions of a social, psychological pathology that comes from having your trust in your learning and your interior flow destroyed because of an artificial confusion that you've learned to think's your fault.
Yeah. Yeah, you do think it. I mean, individuals who don't read well do definitely think it's their fault. This is why they won't talk about it, because they carry the shame or the guilt. I mean, you can be with a group of adults that probably, out of a group of 10, 1 or 2 don't read very well or don't read at all, but they're not going to fess up in a group of adults.
I've had doctors and lawyers,
yeah,
after they understood where we're coming from, start to fess up to it.
Yeah,
feeling self about it.
Well,
I mean, it's...
I'm sure, in your line of work, and even last week I was on the phone and I was making a reservation to go somewhere with Southwest Airlines, and I gave the gal my credit card, the International Dyslexia Association. She starts telling me about her life in school, her life as a dyslexic. I can't get on a plane that I don't sit next to somebody that they don't tell me their life story, And the life story, I was just next to a woman who has a son in Catholic school up in Norfolk that needs somebody to test him because he's going to need accommodations in college because he doesn't read fluently. Surprise, surprise. All right. And of course, he went through school and no one told her that she should get him remediated. They just kept. And he's bright, obviously, because, he's going to go to college, and he must have been, I don't think his SATs were very good. She wanted extra time on SATs, but
he's the bright, great exception.
He's the exception. This is the other thing about dyslexia. I think important for everybody to know. I mean, we're talking about a continuum here. Margaret Rawson said they range the range in terms of intelligence. So we're not talking about someone who has a cognitive handicap, but we could be talking about someone with low average intelligence, or we could be talking about the gifted dyslexic. And in fact, there are a number of individuals in our field, like Gordon Sherman, that are looking at, the diversity of the dyslexic brain and the potential gifts, the abilities versus the disability that comes along with dyslexia. I think that's really critical for us to do, because so often what we do is think about the fact that we allow the disability to define us. All right, we can't allow for the disability to define us, because there's so much more to an individual than that disability. And yet we have to keep kind of right here in front of us that disability does influence all aspects of their lives.
Especially to the extent that it creates this self-shame avoidance in relation to this, because that's going to generalize into a lot of other areas.
Right.
So even though you might not want to associate it as defining it, clearly it's not. Mm-hmm. Like you said, it's influencing.
Well, it's pervasive. Yeah. It's pervasive. I mean, the individual who succeeds is able to compartmentalize it. All right. The individual who's not so successful cannot compartmentalize it. But that's not to say it isn't always there. It is pervasive. Yeah.
Yeah. When we've talked to people, particularly young adults, I mean, we've been in tears interviewing.
Yeah.
The degree. I mean, one of them said, "I feel like a waste of breath."
Yeah. I'll tell you, my brother. My brother's son is dyslexic. All right, and Keith is now about 25, 26 years old. And Keith, when he was in second grade, they diagnosed him as having a learning disability, and they left him back. Surprise, surprise on that one too, right? And when he hit 8th grade, he still didn't know how to read, and he was 6'5", size 15 shoe, been left back, not so good. And my brother and I came down here. The whole family came down here, staying at my sister's. And I said, I'm going to test him. I lived in Massachusetts. I was in New Jersey. I'm going to test him for you, because they finally decided they could talk to me about it. This is the shame. Here comes the shame, okay? He wouldn't let me test him. They all went to the beach. He came back. He kept interrupting me. I finally said to him, you and I are going to the beach. Let's go for a walk on the beach here, and you're going to talk to me about what this is about. Now, my brother's company manufactures microwave connectors and components for communication, telecommunication. I don't know what the heck they are, and I haven't got a clue, but he's very visual, spatial, mechanical, the whole bit. He said to me, I'm afraid you're going to find that he has what I have. And I'm really ashamed. I'm really guilty about this. I gave it to him, right? And I don't want him to experience what I experienced in high school, where everybody thought I was a loser. And I'd love to go back and show all those teachers exactly what it's like now. Christopher, it's not your fault. You know, we had to do the whole 9 yards. This is genetic. You know, yes, it's familial, it's neurological, the whole bit. And finally, it was able to finish the testing, and Wilson Language Systems. Yeah, I have a pretty tight connection with Barbara Wilson, and they're in Massachusetts. Well, the kid went there, and I mean, you know, this story is fine on Keith now, but Keith attempted suicide in high school. So this stuff is
Vital.
It's like, it's more than vital. It's like, and how you get everybody to understand that.
As much as I like, Louisa Moss said one of the greatest things ever on camera to us, which was, the main problem is that our society doesn't understand this.
Yeah.
Right? That's number one.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I'm in total alignment with her. On the other one, on the other hand, I think that trying to make rocket science out of it is the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You got to make this sidewalk, street level,
Yeah.
common knowledge switch about this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think her point about rocket science is well taken from this perspective, that teaching reading isn't easy, and that's the way we treat it right now. We act like we
need to translate the rocket science from the rocket science into a sidewalk level commonsensical thing that people can understand without necessarily becoming rocket scientists to be able to teach
right.
And that comes from, I think, and I hope, but by creating this kind of really compelling, thumping, reorienting, co-registration of all these different planes, right? So that, and then conducting teachers into new kinds of first-person experiences, rather than just load them up with knowledge.
Yeah.
So that's part of what we're really
designing. Yeah.